My name is Justin Harris. I'm a certified functional genomics practitioner for the DNA company. And I got to admit, like, I love the holidays. I really do. I love the food. I love the togetherness. And I mean, Thanksgiving in particular is awesome, right? Because it's a whole day that's devoted to gratitude. And we know what a high frequency emotion that is and all the positive things that happen in your body when you're in that state of gratitude. But the holidays do present a lot of opportunities to kind of lose momentum with our health goals. And I always say, in order to achieve our desired health outcome, we have to align our energy, thoughts, and actions with that outcome because you're in alignment with an outcome regardless, right? Don't think you're not. So we might as well try to preserve as much of our momentum as possible over the upcoming season. And here to discuss, strategies and things for doing exactly that is the all-powerful Dr. Laura Varden. I'm so glad we're doing this together tonight.
You are so sweet. Thank you so much, Justin. I'm so happy to be here with you tonight, hosting this webinar about the holidays, about our genetics, about mood, and how all of that works and what we can do about it. And I'm so happy to be here with you, our audience. We're very grateful to have you here and to prepare yourselves for the upcoming holidays, for all the wonder and enjoyment and fun, along with all the struggles. And we want to lessen those struggles and increase that enjoyment. So once again, if you are new here with us at the DNA company and at these webinars, I would love to see, put a 1 in the chat if you are brand new, because I want to make sure that for myself, my name is Dr. Laura Varden. I am Dean of the DNA University and one of the in-house clinicians here at the DNA company. And Justin is just an amazing clinician, in-house clinician here again at the DNA company. So we want to make sure that you know who we are, what we're doing, and why we're here. Look at all those ones. Welcome. Thank you for
Welcome.
joining our community. We are so incredibly pleased to see you. And I'll tell you, we are so happy to have our recurring audience members. And if you have been here before, even if it was once, put a 2 in the chat. I'd love to see how many we have that are our repeat offenders.
Yeah, and don't forget to fill out the poll while you guys have it there because we will be going over that and that helps us to sort of direct the conversation. And I'll give you guys another minute to do that. And while you're doing that, I mean, we can just give a bit of an overview of tonight. I really think that a big part of my health coaching comes down to this concept that I talk about with stacking wins and mitigating L's, right? Losses. We don't want to take too many losses because health fitness, I mean, this is such a momentum game and it's difficult to build it and it's quite easy to lose it. And one of the things that I always say is like, don't lose in your winning season, right? So we've got this season coming up. It's a season of abundance and gratitude and all these great things, but we need to take it upon ourselves to make sure that we don't start stacking L's in that season, right? Every decision that we make with our fitness, with our food, with our mindset, these are the things that are under our control and they do stack up and they add up over time. So because we have a season coming up where we're going to have maybe more opportunities to binge or to do some not so good things for our body, we need to remember that every decision you make is either a W or it's an L. And we want to make sure that we're trying to mitigate as many of those L's as possible and stack those wins as high as we can get them. And there's plenty of strategies and ways that we can do that going into these feasting seasons.
And it definitely helps for those New Year resolutions that include some sort of health goal, weight loss. Let's try to make those W's that much easier to attain, that you're not making that goal so far out that it seems, unattainable. So one thing I would like to do before we really dive into the meat of the information, I would love to see the answers to the poll questions. Danny, if you could please bring that up and we can go over it. All righty, let me bring this down to where I can see it a little better. All right, so thank you so much, everyone, for filling this out. And one of the things that I'm sure everyone, at some point has felt certain feelings, emotions, or even physiological things after eating a big meal. And our first question is exactly about that. When you eat, and yes, we did put in a qualifier, big holiday meal, how do you feel? And interesting that the majority of you, almost half of you, said it depends on what I eat. And you know what? You're absolutely right. That can be the major differentiator of having symptoms, more adverse symptoms as compared to not. But the next one that came up, sleepy or bloated. And one of the major reasons for that, which we're going to be talking about when we talk about the gut brain axis and mood, how your gut biome and the food that you feed them, the metabolites they make, how that makes us feel. But when we eat a lot of food, we go into a rest and digest mode because we have to slow down and allow our bodies to digest the food that we have. Well, if we put a lot of food in there, guess what? Your body's got a lot of work to do to digest that food. So it's like, time out, let's calm our bodies, let's not move around so much, because when you're up and running around, that puts you in more of a sympathetic state, more of that, energy, I've got to run away from a tiger type thing. So yeah, slowing down and feeling bloated can sometimes, again, depending on what you eat, those metabolites that the microbes make will cause gas as to be produced, giving you that feeling. And that's followed up by happy and content. Hey, that's wonderful. That means that you're probably eating some of the right foods that allow you to feel that way. And then a smaller percent said moody or low energy. Again, all directed by the foods, if you have sensitivity to those foods, and also the composition of your gut biome and the metabolites that they make, which again, we are going to be diving into a little bit more in further in this webinar. So for our next question, we really, we're asking, what do you struggle with? And overindulging was our number one. And I'll tell you what, I have a genetic predisposition to do that myself. And it's tough, especially when you have this plethora of food, that is so readily available, that's out and, cookie and goodies, platters at work and on the table and at friend's house that aren't normally there, and food, just such an abundance of food. And yeah, it is much more easy to overindulge. And, coming up after that was really somewhat close between staying consistent with those healthy habits, which I know Justin is going to give some fantastic information and tips on how to do that, but also the sugar cravings. And this again works in with the gut biome and what is being produced by those little buggies in our guts, that make us continue to crave, which works into our DNA as well. So yeah, the emotional and stress eating, that really works in so much to our mood and behavior genetic profile. If you have done your DNA 360, put a 1 in the chat, please. Because if you have this, you have armed yourself with the blueprint of how you process information, of the way your neurotransmitters are created, cleared, works through all of this. So that can empower you to go, yeah, I do tend to have emotional eating, stress eating, which can say, okay, you know that, so you can prepare yourself to employ techniques to help you through these types of holiday season goodies when there's so much food available. So yeah, I see a lot of ones. Fantastic. So we're going to be looking into different reports in your DNA 360, definitely your mood and behavior report. So make sure you have that handy or that you can grab that. We're also going to be looking at some of your diet nutrition genes that are in that report. So again, have that ready, and that way you can, flip through either on your app, on our the DNA Way app, or, right from your reports, or if you've even printed them out. So that's where we're going to be looking tonight. Another question that we asked was if you've noticed a connection between what you eat and how you feel. And I am very pleased to see 60% of you said, yep, absolutely. You're aware, and which arms you even more into knowing, okay, I'm going to eat this, I'm not going to eat this. Or if you go, yeah, I know how that's going to make me feel, but I'm making an informed decision. I'm going to do it anyway. So be prepared for how you're going to feel. So where, other aspects or other answers when you said, well, yeah, maybe I've wondered about it, or not really, or never really thought about it before. This is a chance for you to understand genes, the gut brain axis, mood, and then having an environment, holiday season that really tests you on these things. So I really hope that you guys take time to pay attention through this holiday season with the foods that you are putting in your mouth, to then consciously think about, how am I feeling? What is my mood like? Do I have energy? Do I feel fatigued? Do I feel tired? Do I feel bloated? Do I feel super energetic and awesome? Pay attention to that. So really take the time to be mindful in the next coming months for that. And I thank you for the ones. And it also shows about having your DNA or gut health. So, I see that, over 30% of you have done both. Fantastic. A little over 40% have done just your DNA. Only one of you have done, or 1%, sorry, of you have done a gut test. Well, this could be an opportunity for you to get to know a little bit more, because when your genes, they don't change. Okay. Those are standard for the rest of your life. All right. But your gut microbiome, that composition can shift, that can change. And as you'll learn, that can make a difference on how well you can navigate these types of seasons in the foods that you eat. So, and I hope that for those of you who haven't done either test, that this will encourage you to go, I think I want to know a little bit more about myself, and to really get personalized for what you need to do, not what, is being told that everybody should do. And our final question is, what do you want to know about this session? What do you want to take away? And this is beautiful because, we have a nice spread on this, but our number one is simple ways to feel better for this holiday season. Well, we're going to give plenty of that for sure. And then that was followed up by, gut effects. How does the mood and energy, and how does this work? Definitely going to dive into that because I'm such a nerd and I love to do that. So, and then finally, why do you crave sugars, certain foods? Again, that will be woven in here too. So we are definitely going to give you some pearls of wisdom to walk away. Thank you so much for answering these poll questions. We really appreciate it. And it really helps to shape how we discuss things in our webinars. All right, Justin.
Let's dive into some of the things that separate us, right? Some of the different things that make different people tend to have those cravings. And same with like satiety signaling and some of the different kind of things that we consider at the DNA company as to what's going on there. Why does one person have the capacity to eat just one cookie and then the next has to have the whole bag or the whole box? Like, what really is going on there? And it's important to note here that when we talk about genes, right, we are not talking about anything that exists in a vacuum. I'm not a fan of when people say this is the Alzheimer's gene, this is the obesity gene. There's a lot going on. And remember, too, that your genes are not your destiny, right? Genes are going to encode enzymes, and enzymes are going to tell your cells how to behave at a baseline. But there's a very, very actionable and empowering thing in the world called epigenetics, right? That's what we have control over. And we have this genome, but then it's going to react to all the different things that we do. Again, our energy, thoughts, and actions can really make it so that our gene expression changes over time. So what we want to do is harness that, right? And get the best quality epigenetic input possible given the spectrum of choices that we have. And that's what's ultimately going to manifest as the best health outcome possible. So Dr. Laura was saying about your executive function profile, mood, and behavior. I invite you to go ahead and dive into that because we're going to talk a little bit about some of these pathways of relevance. I think the dopamine pathway is definitely a relevant one here. So maybe I'll start with that one. Dopamine is so important, right? It's very powerful, and it's always been this driver for our species, right? It's a motivator. It gets you up and gets you moving. And it's really important to note that when we're talking about this dopaminergic pathway, your brain doesn't know the difference between getting a dopamine hit from pleasure or getting it from reward. It's actually both, right? So either or can stimulate this pathway. And modern day, 2025, we have so many opportunities to give our brains that dopamine hit that it wants. The problem is that the more pronounced that dopamine spike is, and then the more often you draw from that well, there's an incredible slingshot thing that happens with dopamine, where the more it raises, there's an equal drop, right? So it goes up high when you have like a really dopaminergic food, like a quick energy food, like a sugar or a carbohydrate. You get this dopamine spike, and then it will actually go below baseline to the same extent as it rose. So when we do this stuff all the time and we spike our dopamine, what happens is over time, the baseline will actually adjust to that, be closer to the bottom end of that spectrum. So you end up more tired. You end up less motivated. I mean, this is what happens with dopamine. Maybe more grumpy, right? It can create, depressive tendencies in different people, but there is a significant genetic component to what we're talking about here as well. So there's a couple of different movers here. There's actually 3 different genes that we look at that are all located in the mood and behavior section. So the first one is actually a methylation gene. It's called COMT, and COMT methylates neurotransmitters like dopamine. It's actually a neuromodulator, but trying to keep it relatively simple here. So when I say methylates in this circumstance, I just mean it makes it available. And then COMT is also a clearance mechanism because you can't just stay up in the clouds forever, right? Sooner or later, you've got to come back down. So COMT is going to make it available to be taken up by the receptor site, and then it's going to go ahead and clear it away. So the different speeds of that COMT enzyme are going to really translate to how quickly or slowly your dopamine is going to clear. And they can both present the problem if you have the slowest version of COMT or if you have the fastest version of COMT. If you have a really fast version of COMT, it means that your dopamine is going to clear super quick. And we do find that there's some connection there with that and like addictive tendencies because it goes away so quick on you that you're left kind of searching for the next thing. Or the opposite issue would be if you have that longer version of COMT, the really slow COMT, because then when your dopamine spikes, it takes so long to clear that you're like in the clouds for too long. And we find that's more of a binging tendency. The ideal form of COMT when it comes to this particular subject would be actually that medium genotype. It's AG. That's what we call more of a Zen genotype because it kind of, you're going to feel the dopamine and that's great, but then it's also going to clear at an appropriate rate instead of too quick or too slow. This gene, for this conversation, we have to marry it to another gene called DRD2. That is the dopamine receptor. And believe it or not, different people have different like densities to their DRD2. So if you have a lot of density there, that's going to really manifest as a more pronounced feeling. That pleasure or reward that you feel from the dopamine is going to really be determinant there because if it's really dense, it just means there's more and more binding to the receptor. So picture this, right? You've got the highest density, the GG for DRD2, and then you've also got a really quick clearance. Well, now the dopamine spike was really intense and it went away super quick. We can imagine how that translates to you going back to the refrigerator or the cabinet. Same with the long clearance. If you've got a lot of dopamine receptorship going on and it clears super slow, that's binging tendencies 101. And these are the people that just can't put it down, can't watch one episode on Netflix. They have to watch the whole season in an evening, that kind of a thing. I think I missed MAO there. You want to dive in a little bit to that one?
Well, MAO really it works with the clearance. Well, first of all, MAO, it's monoamine oxidase, and these enzymes regulate the breakdown of dopamine and serotonin. So, certain MAO gene variants, okay, so when we're talking about variants, because I'm sure, by the way, you guys are probably going, wait a minute, what's the fast? What's the slow? What does it look like? So, for COMT, a fast COMT, like what Justin was talking about, would be a GG genotype. Okay. A slow would be a genotype. And actually, it's the same setup for like DRD2, where if you have the maximum density of dopamine receptors, that's a GG. If you have the minimum density receptors, it's AA. Okay. So just to kind of give some basis on that when you're looking at your report. So for MAO, for it to be a fast breakdown of the dopamine and serotonin, that would also be a GG genotype. If you are slow, it would look as a TT genotype. If it's moderate, somewhere in the middle, that's a GT. Okay, so just want to make sure that we had that. So really, with the MAO gene variants, okay, especially the slower clearance. All right. This increases impulsivity and mood swings. It can manifest in reactivity, difficulty with self control, especially during emotionally charged eating situations like the holidays. And that genotype can actually drive stronger emotional responses to food temptations and less inhibition, which really can make portion control harder, especially under stress when you're piling on all of these different factors. It can just make things a little bit more difficult. Not impossible. There are
Definitely
techniques.
not. Yeah, and that's, it's important to remember, of course, we're talking still about epigenetics, right? So it's like harnessing the dopamine pathway, I think is actually under talked about. I think I did a whole webinar with, I believe it was Dr. Adelia about dopamine. And I recommend you guys check that out because we talked about different strategies of how to harness that. But I'll tell you, in my own practice here, like I'm finding more and more, I'm recommending dopamine fasting strategies now. Like I'm telling people to take time off social media. I'm telling people to take time to unplug, unwind, because you can, in fact, reboot that pathway. But if you're looking at toxic news stories every half hour throughout the day, you're just going to constantly spike it. And remember, you're always going to be adjusting that baseline again. So you end up kind of craving it and you can end up addicted to any little thing that's giving you that dopamine. So dopamine fasting is very, very valuable. And it's something that I recommend pretty consistently now.
I do want to give a little bit of pushback of clarity here, and I love how we have these discussions, because I do have to say that dopamine, being a very necessary neurotransmitter, it's not like you can get rid of it totally. Okay. And I know that that's not what Justin is saying. So when he's saying dopamine fasting, it's a matter of not having so much input, not putting more pressure on that pathway that is causing you to have that overload, okay? Not causing that stronger emotional response, like I just explained. He's not talking about, no, you're getting rid of and not having any dopamine at all. You have to have some dopamine, and honestly, there's no way for you to not have any dopamine. You can't totally clear it. Okay. It doesn't work that way. But what you want to do is, kind of balance out the inputs. And so that way you can better control and kind of smooth out the sharp edges of it. Okay. So I do want some clarity on that. Just so people aren't thinking like, oh, I can just not have any dopamine. So,
Yeah, well, and the term fast is not necessarily entirely appropriate there, but again, you can also obtain dopamine from its both pleasure and reward, right? So I think that the pleasure end of things is where a lot of people are deriving it from. And I mean, you can get a dopamine hit from a great quality workout or just the accomplishment of positive tasks. And that's a way that I recommend kind of loopholing yourself into making dopamine work for you. right? Like
Right.
you can make it a reward instead of pleasure. And it's like, okay, well, I get to have a big, tasty protein shake after I do my leg day. Fantastic. I've got some dopamine, but it's like I'm getting bigger and stronger and doing it in a way that's natural and actually benefiting my health. It's really about cutting out some of the more unnatural sources of dopamine that, ancestrally speaking, we didn't have a flashing device in our hand, right? That we could go back to and go back to with our monkey
Right.
mind. So that's more so what I meant. But thank you for the clarification on that, Dr. Laura. Important
Oh,
point.
absolutely. And we dopamine helps with motivation, and also, getting a hug from your spouse or your child or your grandchild, that gives you dopamine hit along with oxytocin and some other things. But, that is very important. And that's the kind of inputs that you really want to lean into.
Absolutely. So, I mean, that's the dopamine pathway. It's very important. And that's one of the interesting things is that dopamine, along with a lot of other neurotransmitters, can be created in that gut. So I know that we want to get into a little bit of that connection there between these different nervous systems that exist in the body. Like we have our central nervous system, and then the gut actually has its own nervous system, right? The enteric nervous system. And there's a ton of interplay there that happens between the two. So, it's called a bidirectional circuit, right? So that means that this brain impacts the bottom brain, and the bottom brain impacts the top brain, and it goes back and forth. The nervous system is so fascinating. Like it's crazy that we have this thing that actually connects to the back of our retinas, and it runs down our spinal column, and it sort of feeds the intelligence into our bodies. That's why I often recommend people really pay attention to taking care of their spine, their back. Like I know that you've had plenty of injuries there, Dr. Laura, and it's like if you have compressed discs or malalignment, it can actually prevent your nervous system from feeding intelligence into your adrenals, right? Like it can cause a lot of different issues with different nerves and things. So, taking care of your back is very important for that. And just know that that nervous system will feed into the gut nervous system. We have things like the ANS, we have things like the vagus nerve. I mean, there's a lot of little communication pathways that take place there. If you have an unhealthy gut, you are going to have issues with your brain, your cognition, your melatonin, your serotonin, your dopamine. I mean, there's so much going on there. Dr. Laura, do you want to go ahead and nerd out on that for a second?
Well, yeah, because actually there's a paper that was published back in 2018 in Integrative Medicine that specifically talked about the gut-brain axis and its influence of the microbiota on mood and mental health. And, it was really interesting because the paper really explored the gut brain axis. And we can put a link to the paper, Vanny, if you could do that so people could take a look at it, because it's a great informational paper. It really looked at that complex bidirectional communication network that Justin was just talking about, that, it occurs through neural, endocrine, humoral, metabolic, even immune pathways, and is a major focus, when it comes to the role of the gut microbiota in shaping brain function, mood regulation, cognition, behavior, stress responses. We are just really opening up that Pandora's box to understand the strength, the impact that our gut microbiome has on our entire system. And it was really interesting because, it dove into the certain aspects, of that communication, that there was really four main pathways. The neural, okay, so the microbes interact with the vagus nerve. The longest, it's the 10th cranial nerve, it's the longest nerve of the body, and it is what can, when triggered or when activated, gets you into that parasympathetic rest digest, the calm, chill. But microbes interact with the vagus nerve and produce neurotransmitters like GABA, okay, calming, serotonin, acetylcholine. These all alter behavior and stress response. The second pathway was endocrine. So gut bacteria affect hormone release, like cortisol using the HPA axis, hypothalamus pituitary adrenal axis. and through that, enteroendocrine peptides like galanin, okay? The third pathway was the metabolic humoral. So microbiome metabolites. So this stuff, and when I say microbiome metabolites, what exactly does that mean? That means the little buggies, okay, when they get food, they break it down and create metabolites, and they can create a lot of different types of metabolites. One of them, short chain fatty acids. And this is one in particular for that metabolic aspect, because short chain fatty acids, so we're talking about acetate, butyrate, propionate, okay? These are the smaller carbon, like 2, 3, 4 carbon chains, all right? They are small enough to cross the blood-brain barrier. They regulate microglia, some of the cell types in the brain, and they influence serotonin production. Most of the serotonin that we make is made in the gut. So very, very important. But something else that you need to be made aware of is that they can also create what we call LPSs, lipopolysaccharides. This is not a good thing. It can actually cause dysbiosis, which can trigger systemic inflammation, which is associated with depression. Okay, so that's why it's really important to know what the composition of your gut is, to know what buggies are in there, and how large, is each of their population. We have a test for that. Our DNA Gut 360 Premium test actually helps to test that. It's a stool test. Yes, your poop. It's a stool test where it looks at all of that. It looks at the major families. It looks at the individual species and can relate that to certain issues, problems, and also give you insights into how to correct that. So, for those of you who haven't done our Gut 360 Premium test, I do highly recommend that. It can really give amazing information, like what I talked about earlier, where your DNA doesn't change. Need it for your blueprint, okay, for the basis of what you're working with. But the gut biome test, our Gut 360 Premium test, looks at how is your gut right now, because that can change. Thankfully, you have the power to make that change. So getting back to the fourth pathway, this is our immune system. Gut microbiomes, these microbes, they shape what we call cytokine signaling. Okay, cytokines can trigger inflammation in the body. So when you have dysbiosis, meaning that your population is off, okay, that could increase inflammatory markers. So for those nerds out there who actually look at markers, these are things like IL-6, TNF alpha, CRP, C-reactive protein, okay? These can actually be measured on blood tests, etc. And these are commonly elevated in depression, stress-related disorders, okay? So stress and dysbiosis can also increase intestinal permeability, leaky gut, all right? That allows inflammatory molecules to circulate to further impact mood and cognition, because if you have leaky gut, sure enough, you're going to have leaky brain. So this study was, this paper really dove into looking at, the trials and looking at how probiotics, showing how that actually had promising effects, where multi-strain formulas targeting gut barrier function actually showed strongest effects, beneficial effects. And, it goes through, but it just goes to show you the impact. And this was back in 2018. Look how much we've gone in the last 7 years. And there's a lot more research out there about that. How far we have come to be able to affect the change of our gut biome and ultimately our immune system, our metabolic function, our endocrine hormones, and our brain function.
Yeah, and I think that the effect of all of those things are that much more amplified around the holiday season. Like a lot of people are very stressed when it comes to, around Thanksgiving, around Christmas. A lot of people get that extra activation of the HPA axis that you mentioned. I really think it's an under talked about thing, as far as how the HPA axis impacts the gut. You mentioned IL-6 and TNF alpha. All of these things are created in what's called the mast cells. And if you guys are familiar with the mast cells, it's because that also releases histamine, right? Like we've all heard of mast cell activation syndrome, and histamine. All of these things are a part of that immune system that exists in your gut. And what a lot of people don't know is that when you have a lot of cortisol, that can also stimulate these mast cells, and you end up with these cytokines that get released, pro-inflammatory cytokines. And there's this big long cascade that takes place there because your gut can impact your thyroid, and if you have things like leaky gut present, by the way, it's going to majorly impact your body's ability to stay in that state of biosis, because the mucosal layer is kind of paradoxical in its role. It's necessarily thin, like very thin, because it's there to allow nutrients in, but it's paradoxical because it also has to keep bad guys out. And when it becomes compromised and you have what we call a mucosal injury, it means that these opportunistic bacteria can work their way in. They tend to act as like a bully, so they will actually bully out positive, beneficial species, and you end up with this dysbiosis. And you also end up with a lot of food sensitivities as well. I noticed that in the poll, not that many of you have had food sensitivity screening. I personally am a big fan of food sensitivity screening. And like Dr. Laura mentioned, the gut is a dynamic environment. It's not static like the genes, the genotypes. There's constant die-off, and then there's reintroduction of different species, and then there's the mucosal layer to consider. So if you do have leaky gut, you're probably going to have more food sensitivities than somebody else. And I recommend getting that looked at maybe even once a year, because that's something that will change. And when you break down a plate of Thanksgiving food, even if you think it's healthy, you may be reacting to 3 out of 7 items on that plate and not know it, right? Because this is not an allergy, it's a sensitivity. So you're not going to get this visceral thing. You're probably not going to have your throat close up, or you're probably not going to get a breakout of eczema or something like that. It's going to be more subtle. That little bit of achiness, that little bit of brain fog, that little just lack of energy or mood, that can be due to food sensitivities. And even things like gluten, which we can look at when it comes to your genes. There's a family called HLA that can point to that. And then there's other markers like gliadin. I think it's one of those two. Gliadin, is that how you pronounce it?
Gliadin, yes.
Okay.
Yeah,
So
yeah, galanin. Well, that's the peptide for like cortisol. So yes,
right. So there's more than one marker here, is
yes,
what I'm
certain.
saying. But gluten sensitivity is actually more of a nightmare than you think, because so if you have a sensitivity that we've established, be it because of your genes or be it something in your gut that we've identified, that is a really long lasting antibody. And just a handful, like a little bit of something that contains gluten, can kick off that immune response for 2 all the way up to 6 months. So think about that. I mean, when's the last time, like, even if you try to limit your gluten because you suspect the sensitivity, have you gone 6 months without a trace of it? It's pretty hard to do, right? So I recommend, like, if you're going to go gluten free. I mean, like, cut it out and find alternatives. We'll talk a little bit about that in a minute, as far as like alternative strategies here, how you can still have a satisfying meal. But sensitivities are something that you have to cut out for a certain period of time to really get your gut rehabilitated properly. And I mean, anybody who's having a Thanksgiving meal, there could be the cranberries, and you have no idea that that's reactive for you. And for somebody else, it's the carrots that they put in the mashed potatoes. You can react to any or none of the above, but having like an up-to-date food sensitivity screening can have magical gut healing properties. I've seen it clinically a lot of different times. So just food for thought, quote unquote, on that one.
Yeah, and I mean it's really important because you have to decide, how do I want to feel? How do I want to be? I mean, it's you really want to go in knowing. So if you are going to eat something you're sensitive to, that and you know what you're going to feel like afterward. Like, for example, and I will out myself. So last week was my birthday, and my granddaughter, my daughter-in-law, made me a cake, and they got ice cream. And of course, I had some, but I'll tell you what, for the next several days, my joints, I woke up and my hands were stiff. It was a little bit more difficult doing my workouts. And I was just like, wow, just having it, that piece of cake and some ice cream. Now, granted, I knew what it would do. I went in knowing, is it something I will do on a regular basis? No. But, seeing that my granddaughter helped make it, I had to. But here's the thing. I knew better. And, I made that conscious decision. And I think that that's very important. You're an adult. We are not telling you, don't do this, we are offering ideas going, hey, this is what can happen if you take the food sensitivity test, if you have your DNA, if you have, the results of your DNA Gut 360 premium and something, and you have the information, you are informed, okay, then you are making informed decisions. And then that's just on you for whatever the consequences are, having a W or having an L. So, how are you going to stack it?
Yeah, for sure. And food really is one of those primary epigenetic
Mm-hmm.
factors that we talk about, right? Like I like to say, if you eat 3 meals a day, well, those are 3 opportunities per day for you to present your body with either high quality epigenetic signals or low quality epigenetic signals. And once they're in there, they're going to interact with the genome and you're going to end up altering your phenotype, which is what you actually sort of land with. So, seizing control of that is very, very important. Food is a never ending input that we have control over every day. And what's really interesting is that besides processed food, like stuff that's like really, our body just has no way of recognizing it because it's too recent in human history that we kind of put it into the mix. But
Mm-hmm.
even healthy food, right? Among the list of healthy food, our bodies can react drastically different to it. And it's not because of any of the inherent properties of the food. The person is what makes the difference. And that's the paradigm shift here. If I just prescribe, you should go on a paleo diet because paleo is awesome and that's what humans are meant to eat. Well, within the paleo diet, you could be having almonds and sweet potatoes and honey, and you may be actually reacting to 3/4 of the things that I just recommended for you. Because even though it's healthy food, you are what made the difference in how it actually interacted. It was your microbiome and it was your genes and it was your food sensitivities that ultimately determined that that wasn't a healthy food for you, right? That's a huge paradigm shift in how people look at nutrition. It's not the food, it's the person, right? And if we can start thinking about it in that way and viewing things through the lens of epigenetic inputs and gut microbiota and all these different things, we're going to end up landing people on way, way more ideal diets that are going to actually benefit your metabolism as well as your immune system. So the food isn't good or bad unless it's blatantly standard American diet poison.
And I actually want to do a check-in with our audience. Um, if you have noticed that your mood has changed with certain foods that you eat, put a Y in the chat. I'd love to see, because I know several of you have said that, yeah, I notice food affects me, but I mean, now, even for the others that were like, oh, I'm not quite sure. Now that we've been talking and thinking about it, look at all the whys. Yes.
Yeah.
Excellent. Yeah, it really does. We really need to start getting back in touch with our bodies, what we are exposed to and what we put in our mouths, because absolutely, from what we've already talked about, I'm sure that you are now being much more aware of how much that affects our mood, our health, the way we move our joints. So, actually, I would love to start diving into some more of the genes, because there are some other genes, that are influencing when we talk about food, mood, addiction. And I know we've already talked about some of it, but there are a few other genes, I mean, besides DRD2, COMT, MAO, that play a part in how we are able to be disciplined, how that works. Because a lot of people said, yeah, the overindulgence, the sugar cravings. So, Justin, what's another gene or a couple of genes? Oh, thank you, Sheila. She wished me happy birthday. Fellow Scorpio, yes. Can you name a couple other genes that are relevant when it comes to food, mood, and addiction?
Sure. So I think that some of the other really direct genes on this pathway, they're in your diet and nutrition sections there in the DNA 360. And we do have genes that really are impactful for this like leptin and ghrelin signaling, right? Ghrelin being the hunger hormone, leptin being a satiety hormone. And there's a couple of genes that we look at that are a little bit different, but kind of the same theme. The first one is called FTO, and this is the one that I mentioned earlier that I'm not a big fan of labeling something the blank gene, right? So FTO is basically called the fat and obesity gene. I'm not a fan of that as far as we know that there's a lot of different things going on, like we've talked about. But what that really is it's impactful for when you start eating your food. There is, in fact, a signal that's going to start to go from the gut to the brain, again, bidirectional circuit. And once it hits the brain, it effectively tells you in layman's terms, stop eating, right? Like you're good. We don't need another portion. We don't need more calories. We're all set. And some people, genetically speaking, have a dysregulation in this gene. They have a slower signal. So by the time that it gets to the brain and it tells you to stop eating, you've already gone back, right? You've had the second or the third portion. And that is pretty impactful when it comes to this caloric equation. You know, we all talk about how calories in, calories out isn't the only factor, but it is a factor. I'm not one of these practitioners that says it doesn't matter. Of course it does. The laws of thermodynamics matter, right? Yes, we take in energy and we burn it. So if we take in way too much energy, of course, it's going to result in things like insulin responses and fat accumulation. So the FTO gene is very important there. And then there's another one called MC4R. And that one there is effectively the same idea, but it exists at the level of the palate, right? You start chewing down the food and the different sensations. It sends a signal from the mouth to the brain that says, okay, we're good. I'll quickly go over the alleles here as well for MC4R. So the T allele is considered optimal, and the C allele is considered suboptimal. For the FTO gene, the T allele, once again, is considered optimal, and the C allele is considered suboptimal or dysregulated. In conversations with clients, I pair this with what we talked about with that dopamine pathway. Heaven forbid you're a high binder of dopamine, right? And a long clearer of dopamine. And then you've also got dysregulation in these satiety signals. It's very likely that, you know, food may be among the vices of choice when it comes to how you dopamine binge, because you just don't feel full quickly either, right? So some of these genes, like we try to map it out because there's a lot of connection points between the two. What are some other genes that come to mind for you, Dr. Laura?
Well, before I jump into some other genes, I want to give a little bit more on the FTO gene because when we're talking about the FTO, this does regulate those appetite regulating hormones, ghrelin, which deals with hunger, and leptin, dealing with satiety. Okay. And there's actually studies that have confirmed the FTO variants. Okay. So if you are dysregulated in your FTO gene, so meaning that you have an A allele, all right, that there's stronger preference for sweets, fatty foods, higher caloric intake, and like you have already said, that less effective satiety signaling. So it really is about biology, not willpower. And this really can explain, you know, the overeating. You know, it's something that I have to deal with because my FTO is dysregulated. But I've learned, first of all, it's the knowledge of knowing, okay, I'm genetically susceptible to that. So that makes sense why, you know, I've had behaviors in the past. But it's going, okay, I need to lean in even more on techniques. So some techniques, because you guys are probably wondering, yes, that's me. I've seen a couple in the chat saying, yep, that's what I do. A few things that you can do, and especially around the holidays when there's buffets. Okay, not so good at buffets, you know, tend to eat and eat and eat and then, you know, eating too much. So what you do, take a plate, just take a little bit, and then don't be going back, you know, just eat that. Eat slowly. Allow that time for your gut to tell your brain, I'm full. Don't eat mindlessly. I know at parties, that you're just kind of, drinking and eating food while you're talking and you're not really paying attention. You tend to eat more. So maybe at those times that just don't have any food on in your hand or on your plate, have some water, have, something else, try to limit the alcohol because that's not really, good for your body. But another thing that you can do is have some food before you go to the party, before you go to this buffet or whatever. Start and do it choosing healthy foods for yourself. So that way it gives your body, your gut, a chance to tell your brain, okay, I'm getting full, I'm not real hungry. So that way when you get to the party, you'll already have some fullness and you won't tend to eat as much. It'll help so you don't feel, because we don't want you feeling ravenous at a buffet. Also doing things like postprandial exercise or walking. Okay, what that means is after eat, go for a 5-minute walk. Just move around. Allow the muscles to pull the glucose that is now in your bloodstream, into the muscle for use. Any other quick little tips, tricks for people with dysregulated FTOs or MC4R genes?
Yeah, and full disclosure, I'm also dysregulated here, and I just, like my lady's brother-in-law thinks I have a tapeworm or something because I can just like I can go back and just it never ends. And it's really crazy like the volume of food I can put away if I choose to. And so I have a few strategies to make sure that I don't, get too many negative effects from that. And one of the main ones actually is just like when your mom said chew your food, like that's really good advice. And I think it's underutilized advice. Saliva changes the pH of the food. Like when you start chewing, that's actually what starts the whole process of the chemical signaling, the release of various enzymes. That's what happens when you chew, right? So if you're just taking a couple bites and then swallowing it, you're not going to have those signals speeding up the way that you would want them to. If you're dysregulated for MC4R, I mean, the more flavor profiles per meal that you can have, the better, because that also tends to speed up the signal. So that's another thing. I'm a big fan of gratitude practice. Like we say, Thanksgiving, that's what it's all about. But don't do it after you eat, do it before, right? Do it before you actually start that first bite, because that is going to effectively shift your body into a parasympathetic and a receptive state. Rest and digest. There's a reason why we call it that, so don't neglect it. Remember that there's people in the world that don't have food, and we do, and we should be grateful for that. And if you just take a moment with it, that can actually help to get your digestive system kind of geared up and ready. Now, once you've already eaten and you've had a big old meal, I love doing like the postprandial exercise, be it a walk, a few kettlebell swings, whatever. Get that movement on. And then I also personally like to time a little bit of a fast if I can. So if I'm on purpose having like a really big meal, it's a good time for me to just take a break after that. Because again, the laws of thermodynamics, at least I'm giving my body a chance to work through it and really just suppressing the calories a little bit for the next day, because it will ultimately even out by the end of the week, right? It's not necessarily a day by day thing. If you zoom out and your body goes, well, we had abundance at this time and we had scarcity at that time, that's metabolic flexibility, and it's absolutely fine. There's ways you can hack that with essential amino acids. You can utilize ketone esters. I mess around with all that kind of stuff. Then the other thing I would say would be blood sugar regulation is a very valuable thing to consider, right? Especially with, the buns and the potatoes and the different things that you may have at Thanksgiving. So personally, like I utilize apple cider vinegar. There's berberine, there's Ceylon cinnamon. If you're up for a quick cold plunge, that actually helps with regulating blood sugar as well, assuming you do it properly. All of those things are valuable. I also like to take a big old handful of enzymes surrounding these meals, right? If you can get enzymes that have like amylase in there, it's going to digest starches, and lipase for fatty acids. You can get lactase if you're going to have a lot of dairy, dipeptidyl peptidase if you're going to have gluten, that can counteract some of those downsides. So point being, have a little army of strategies surrounding these meals if you suspect you're going to overdo it, and you can at least mitigate some of the metabolic downside that way.
Yeah, and that's such great advice. And with so many people who are gluten-free, dairy-free, have so many eating restrictions, it's not out of the norm anymore. So I have found in the past handful of years that it's a little bit easier when you go to someone's house or to have a meal, that you now have some options that you can actually partake in if you have those dietary restrictions. Of course, it never hurts that if it's a potluck type thing, make foods that you can eat. And also eating before you go, so even if you do eat a little bit like a bird when you're there, at least you're not starving. And again, people are a lot more understanding and forgiving. If you say, hey, I've got these food restrictions, or I can't eat that because of whatever. So don't be afraid to advocate for yourself. All right. And it's okay, you can do that. So a couple other, first, before I start with a couple other, or the last two genes that I wanted to touch on, please, if you have questions, put them in the Q&A. I do see that we are getting some wonderful questions going on, but I do want to make sure that if you have a question and you've put it in the chat, please copy and paste that and put that into the Q&A, please, and thank you. All right, so last two genes that I wanted to touch on that are very important when it comes to emotional resiliency, mood, food cravings, everything that we're talking about. These you will find in the mood and behavior section, and they are the 5-HTT-LPR, which is a serotonin transporter, and BDNF, brain-derived neurotrophic factor. And these critically influence your emotional resilience, that mood stability, and the way cravings manifest. So how does this happen? Well, first of all, the 5-HTT-LPR gene, it encodes the serotonin transporter. It basically affects how efficiently serotonin is recycled in the brain. So people who have an S, a short allele, are more sensitive to stress. They show increased emotional reactivity and are more prone to emotional eating, especially when experiencing negative moods or under acute stress. That gene variant having an S, an LS or an SS, okay, which, by the way, full disclosure, I have an SS, so yes, I do deal with this, but it's strongly associated with lower emotional resilience, higher vulnerabilities to environmental triggers for cravings or overeating. So again, this giving you a clue into what could happen. Do you have to fall victim to it? Absolutely not. Okay. You're going to have to put in some work, but you can certainly do it. And, really in practical terms, it means that some people crave comfort foods as a neurochemical attempt to self-soothe, especially during emotional lows, or a tendency that is often occurring during the holidays. So something, again, to be aware of. And for BDNF, our brain-derived neurotrophic factor, this affects mood, neuroplasticity, and even cravings, because it produces a neurotrophin that is crucial for brain health. That is very important for that, what fires together, wires together, that learning, the adaptability of those neuronal circuits that are involved in reward, like what Justin was talking about earlier with dopamine, that pleasure reward, okay? This works in there, and different variants of BDNF. So for BDNF, you'd be looking at, excuse me, a G allele. The GG version is optimal. If you have an A allele, then you start getting into some suboptimal genotypes. And there actually is something that even if you have a GG genotype, which is the optimal version, if you have a GG version of the TPH2, which is serotonin production, it actually can cause an epistatic effect. You're probably like, heck. Epistatic effect means that the way that that gene is, the TPH2, can make the BDNF gene, even though it's optimal, act suboptimally, usually in the fact of ruminations, and kind of reading into things more, or the swirl of the brain, and that can be a little bit of a problem, which can impact stress, which can impact reading things, or being more impacted by stressful situations or environmental situations, especially during the holidays. So when you have a variant of the BDNF, or if it's acting suboptimally, especially if you do have an A version in there, okay, an A allele, that is linked to difficulties in that emotional regulation, greater vulnerability to emotional eating, the cravings. All right. And it also directly regulates appetite and satiety in the hypothalamus. So if you have lower BDNF, that often is observed in eating disorders, binging, bulimia, obesity. Now, I'm not saying that if you have an A allele that you will have these things. This is not diagnostic. It's just that in those populations of people who have been diagnosed with that, they have found a correlation of a BDNF, a lower BDNF genetic expression. Okay. So, when you're talking about high sugar, high fat foods, that can disrupt BDNF signaling, even if you are optimal. Okay. So you don't want to promote that type of emotional eating or hedonic eating. Okay. Just eating whatever makes you feel good. So very, very important to be aware of what you're working with, so you know how to work with it. All right. So
Nailed it. That was a really good explanation, Dr. Laura.
so what do we think? Any last bits of action items, things that people can do to help before we start diving into questions?
I think that the main theme here is just remembering that if we label food as an epigenetic input and think of each and every little calorie that you have as being something that is information that is going to impact how your body behaves and performs, I think that's a really good way to kind of frame it. Food is information. And if you give your body high quality information, you're going to get high quality output from your body. And the exact same is true for the opposite. So start to recognize food as that exact thing. It's not just something that's here because it tastes good and then that's it. It's a one and done thing. Once it's in your body, you have now given your body something that it is going to integrate into your genome, and it's going to affect your cells in Lord knows how many ways total. It's going to impact your microbiome. It's going to impact your hormones, your neurotransmitters. Food is absolutely a stimulus, and it's absolutely a signal. So, try to view it through that lens, because it can be both medicine or poison, depending on the person, the volume, etc., and everything in between. So food is a very, very powerful agent. Don't disrespect it, have gratitude for it, and try to recognize and give your body the best possible info you can.
Well, I appreciate that information.
Yeah,
Shall we jump into Q&As?
I think it's about that time.
Perfect. All right. And I do want to preface before we really dive into going through the questions, that if you are asking very specific personal questions, help about your situation, and giving us details, even though I'm a doctor, Justin is not, but we are not your doctors. And there is a lot more when it comes to specific situations, that we cannot be giving medical advice because you are not under our care. Now, if you want to be under our care and work with the practitioners here at the DNA Company, please contact us. Vanny will put that in the chat. Actually, she already did, where you can actually speak with one of our consultants to see which program might work best for you, because it's not just about knowing 2 or 3 pieces of information for you. It is knowing your DNA, knowing your blueprint, knowing your history, which is very important. This is a nature and nurture, okay? Two very strong aspects of who you are sitting in front of us, with whom we are working, to really personalize the recommendations that we offer. And testing and all of these other things. We have a motto: test, don't guess. Okay, we aren't just going to be throwing out things at you that would not be appropriate for us to do. We really personalize the work that we do by knowing these things. So when we answer questions, it will be more generalized, in the fact that we can't give out direct medical advice. All right. So that being said, our first question, let's go to Jaden. So Jaden, thank you for being here. I see that it's your first time. You're dealing with some issues, mentioning ulcerative colitis. And, really it's about, diet, DNA, how does that impact health? What can you do? So I understand that, fatigue is an issue, and being hungry. Now, obviously, there's a lot more going on. But when we're talking about in general, yes, genes and diet both influence that particular diseased state, okay, ulcerative colitis. It does affect fatigue. It does affect hunger. And we just spent the last hour really diving in and talking about how that happens, some of the genes that affect that or influence it. In general, okay, in studies, they have found that prioritizing Mediterranean type or style diets, plant-rich diets, favoring cooked, vegetables or easier fruits on the gut, again, the specifics for you would best be determined by having a practitioner really being able to see everything about you. But just like Justin was talking about food sensitivity tests, that's something that would be very useful to you, because you definitely want to avoid triggers. You want to avoid foods that are going to poke the bruise. All right. You don't want to create flares. And this goes for any of you. If you have issues, pay attention to when you eat foods and how you feel. All right. How is your defecation? What's going on? How is your sleep? All right. Looking at that 24 to 48 hours from the foods that you eat, that can really inform you on what to do. And please make sure to work with a healthcare provider, dietitian, one of our practitioners here at the DNA company, to really get a more personalized, focused recommendations to really help you. And I wish you the best of luck and to have a very wonderful holiday season. Thank you for your question. All right, next question is from Susan, and she's asking, what genes would indicate that someone would do better physiologically with a diet higher in carbohydrate or higher in protein or higher in fat? And with that, would they do better with a certain type of fat, like less saturated fat? I know that was a lot. So basically, what genes would help you determine diet structure? Justin.
Yes, so there's a few that we look at, right? Because it's not going to be just one gene equals all here. The first gene I always look at is the insulin response gene, because that's actually going to act as kind of an umbrella for all of the above, right? Because it's not just carbohydrates that can actually impact insulin, right? Like fatty acids can, protein actually can. You can get an insulin response from all of the macronutrients. Carbohydrates would be a bit higher on the offender list there, but understanding that if you have a dysregulated insulin mechanism in the first place, it's going to amplify the issue, and it's going to make it a little bit more difficult to determine what macronutrient structure is going to make the most sense for you. So the gene I'm referencing is in your diet report. It also exists in your cardiovascular report, because we know that blood sugar and insulin are very important there for cardiovascular health. So the gene is called TCF7L2. And dysregulation there is going to basically make it so you have like a 1.5 greater times insulin response when you do take in carbohydrates, too much saturated fats, etc. So TCF7L2 is the first one that I look at. And then the second one that I would look at there is called AMY1, AMY1. That's a salivary amylase gene, and it really is determinant of your metabolism of starches, right? Like how well do you break down starches? Now, this is a whole conversation I have with people because starches, carbs, fats, these are not all created equal across the board. A bag of potato chips is different than an organic yam. You know what I mean? There's differences between starch sources and fat sources, protein sources. But in general, if you're dysregulated for AMY1, it means that you're not going to have a great time at a baseline taking in starches and converting them properly to energy without any metabolic downside. Now, there's things that you can do. You can do carb cycling. You can backload your carbohydrates. You can create resistance when you take rice or potatoes and you cook them and cool them. All of these things will negate some of the downsides to that. But know what your genes are saying in the first place, because we want to achieve metabolic flexibility, and understanding that underlying encoding process of the enzymes is very important there. So for lipids, right, for fatty acids, we look at a gene called APOA2. If you're optimal there, you can take in a fair amount of fats with each meal and you shouldn't have a metabolic consequence to it. But there's another gene called ApoE, which is very important because if you have a 4 allele in ApoE, and that's going to be in your cardiovascular report, it means that you're a little bit more likely to calcify cholesterol, right? So we want to be a little bit more aware of the fatty acid balance if you've got that 4 allele in ApoE. If ApoA2 is fine and you have, let's say, a 3-3 in ApoE, then you can probably handle a fair amount of animal sources, coconut oil, that kind of a thing. But let's be a little bit aware that if you have a 4 allele like I do, that you don't want to go too heavy. Like I wouldn't recommend a carnivore diet for someone with a 4 allele in ApoE. You'd be better off with like a blend of different types of fatty acids, right? So like some monounsaturated sources, some saturated sources, and some omega-3s and things like that added in there, just to get a better overall inflammatory profile with that. Now, with regard to protein, we do not have a direct gene that we look at for protein metabolism. What we do look at would be the GSTM1 gene, and that's in your glutathione reports because it's pretty relevant for the microbiome, the gut microbiome specifically. And if you don't have a good version there, and it's actually a copy number variation, so you can have 0, 1, or 2 copies. If you have 0 copies like I do, or if you have 2 copies, your gut's going to be a bit more reactive to things like carcinogens that happen if you were to burn meat or have meat super left over. So there's a lot of histamines and things in there. So look at that. I still recommend protein prioritization, but it's just about how you cook it, what's the quality of the protein in the first place, etc. I know I'm throwing a lot at you guys. I mean, really a coaching session may be in your interest because there's a few moving parts to the metabolic pathways.
And I mean, that is definitely a fair statement, and I think that her question was more of that general, which you so beautifully explained and offered insights into. And this is exactly why having a report review or working with one of our practitioners is so important, because there are so many moving parts. There are so many, individual dynamics, in these pathways and the permutations that can affect what is best for you. So thank you very much for going into that and explaining it. I have another question. Sheila has some wonderful questions here. One of them is, what brand is your sauna?
Yes, and thank you, Sheila, for recognizing that that is not a porta potty in my office. I've had certain comments about that. That is an infrared sauna, and it's so important that I put it right in my office so that I can hop off a webinar and hop in there and sweat out all the stress. But that particular brand is Clearlight, it's called. And there's a few good brands out there, like Sauna Space is great, Sunlighten is great. You want to be a bit picky and choosy because there are certain brands that don't really take into account like EMF protection, and you can go in there and effectively microwave yourself if it's one of these kind of unreputable brands. So I use Clearlight. It's an American company that happened to have warehouses in Canada, so I lucked out. It's got great attachments too, like you can attach a big old red light therapy device in there. It's different wavelengths. There's something called chromotherapy, so you get a lot of different light spectrums in there. I'm a big fan. I like it. I use it probably, at least 3 times a week, sometimes 5 in the winter, and I do recommend it. It's been nothing but fantastic for me.
Excellent. Yeah, not gonna get me one. Make some space for it. All right. Our next question is from Michelle, and she's saying, when thinking about the gut microbiome, is there a standard healthy diet one should consider, like high fiber, low carb, low fat, vegan, carnivore, avoiding grains, adding grains? I mean, which diet is most beneficial for a healthy gut microbiome? And she does say it gets very confusing. And yes, you're absolutely right. It can. And the thing is that's because there's no single best diet that fits everyone's gut microbiome. But I will say there is strong evidence that does show that diets rich in a diversity of whole plant-based foods, especially those high in fiber, consistently support healthier, more diverse microbiome. And when you're looking at different patterns, and of course, knowing what exactly is best for you, that's when coming and working with a practitioner who can look at all of the things that we've already talked about, to really hone it in and personalize it. But through literature, in research, okay, patterns of eating that are beneficial would be eating plenty of fiber from vegetables, fruits, legumes, beans, nuts, whole grains. Yes, because you want to be feeding the beneficial microbes that boost those short chain fatty acids that I was talking about earlier in this webinar, because that is essential for gut health. You also want to try to include, again, this may be different for other people, but in general, including fermented foods regularly, things like yogurt, kefir, kimchi, sauerkraut, because you really want to increase the microbiome diversity and lower inflammation naturally. Lean into foods first. Might you need probiotics? Yeah, you might. But again, work with a practitioner to see which strains you need, and how you want to navigate that. Absolutely limiting ultra processed foods, limiting added sugars, high saturated fats, consistent high saturated fats. Okay. These are linked with a decreased microbial diversity and increased inflammation. So, really, those plant forward diets, Mediterranean, vegetarian, or even vegan, well, again, not everybody works well. I tried vegan, did not work for me. But the vegetables, okay, these plant forward diets really do help to foster a higher abundance of the beneficial short chain fatty acid producing microbes versus, say, something like, low carb or heavy animal based diets. But then again, when you're talking about carnivore, low fiber diets, granted, they have been shown to reduce microbial diversity, but what is it that you're really getting at? Just looking at the numbers on a test going, oh, I've got huge diversity, but honestly, it comes down to how you feel, because sometimes people need to be on more restrictive therapeutic diets for a short period of time to reduce inflammation, to kind of fix or help to alleviate issues that they have. But again, this is personalized and specific based on each of your needs. So that's why having working with a practitioner is definitely very, very important. Thank you for that question. All right, Justin, I've got a couple questions here, which actually, are the same. Sheila and Jenny asked basically the same thing. And it is, which food sensitivity test or allergy test do you recommend?
Yeah, so the realm of food sensitivity screening has come a pretty long way. Effectively, you're looking at different antibodies that get created in response to whatever food source you might take in. So the one that I personally utilize is from a company called Mosaic Diagnostics, and they make one that's like an IgG and Candida combo test sort of a thing. And it screens for, I believe, 190 different foods. And I like the way that it lays it out because it's pretty simple. It's just red, yellow, green. Anything that's in the yellow or the red section is going to be reactive. So it's really scanning the reactivity levels. If you do choose to do it, my recommendation is to eat as many different types of things before you get it, because that's what's going to create the antibodies, right? So if you want the most robust results, like what I did is I actually used greens powders and stuff like that prior to taking the test, because it's like, now my body is going to like have those present, right? So if I have reactivity to asparagus or, something like that, if I have a little trace amount of that in my body prior to doing the test, the antibodies are going to be fresh and there and easy to detect, right? So that's another little strategy that I use, and it's actually a blood spot, and it can tell you some incredible stuff, your blood. So definitely, it's just like a couple of little drops on a card. You send it in, and you get a big long list of 190 different foods. And these questions that we're getting about ideal diets, to me, that is one of the most important factors. I arrive at an ideal diet by using a couple of different things. It's the genes. Some people do metabolic typing and things like that. I think that's valid, but I think the genes are a little bit more fleshed out. So I take the genes to understand macros and detoxification and liver function and these kinds of things. Then I plug it through the filter of food sensitivity screening. And now we know what the macros should look like. We know how our body's detoxifying. And then we can also use the food sensitivities to screen through the actual sources of the different micronutrients and things that we're taking in. Your liver matters too, guys. I mean, it creates bile, and that's how we digest our fatty acids. So that's part of the equation as well. Some people go on a keto diet, and it's not actually their genes that are the problem. It's that they have liver congestion, and they're just not producing enough bile to properly digest it. So digestion is complicated. I recommend using the tools that we have. Gut mapping, we need to look at your liver, we need to look at your genes, we need to look at food sensitivities. If you really want to get the ideal diet for yourself, don't just follow an influencer and do what they did because it worked for them. It may well not work for you.
All right, thank you. Okay, our next question is from Marianne. And she asked us to speak briefly about grief during the holidays, and the gut. And she did share that her husband just passed away a couple of months ago, and she doesn't really feel like doing any holiday dinners or events. Marianne, my condolences. I'm so sorry. That is a tough situation, and my heart, really goes out to you. And grief, especially after losing a loved one, it does directly affect the gut through that gut brain axis. Intense emotional stress triggers a cascade of stress hormones that can disrupt digestion, that can lead to things like nausea, stomach pain, loss of appetite, bloating, irregular bowels, all of these things. And when it starts getting into chronic grief, that can actually alter the gut microbiome. It can reduce beneficial bacteria and actually increase inflammation, which further can impact mood, energy, and even your immune function. So during the holidays, I will say that missing regular events or meals, changes in your routine, it may make symptoms worse. But it's not saying that you have to force yourself to go and be a part of it. But also don't become a hermit. Have someone that you trust that's very close, even if you don't need to talk, but just to have them near can be very helpful. Also, gentle, nourishing foods, staying hydrated, prioritizing self-care can help you support your gut health while you're grieving. And it is normal to have less interest in food. Please go easy on yourself and know that that physical response to grief is part of the healing process. So again, my condolences, and please have the support to help you through this holiday season without your husband. Thank you for being vulnerable and sharing that with us. All right, last two questions, real quick. What hack do you have for eating gluten when you have gluten sensitivities? You had mentioned earlier. You want to reiterate that?
Yeah, so I mean, the real thing I said before was that there is no hack, that you got to cut it right out because of the how long the antibodies stick around for. So if there is true, reactivity in your body, I recommend just cutting it out entirely and finding swaps, right? Alternatives. That's what I'm doing right now. There's a brand called Satiety Foods that makes these like cassava flour wraps. I'll use rice pasta if I want to carb up. It's gluten free. I can do different things. So finding gluten free alternatives to the things you enjoy eating would honestly be my primary hack there. It's not really a hack, it's a swap. But the other things that you could do would be to, if it's not like a true sensitivity, I recommend taking anything that's grains and really just finding the best case scenario, right? Like a really great quality sourdough bread versus just a Wonder Bread. I mean, there's different levels to this, and there's steps in the right direction that you can take. Anytime that a grain was sprouted or fermented, it has less of these defense chemicals and less gluten as well. It can also be less impactful for your blood sugar. So a sprouted bread, right, like an Ezekiel bread or something like a sourdough that was fermented, those are steps in the right direction. And then what you could do beyond that is take that enzyme that I mentioned. The actual name is dipeptidyl peptidase, but the product name that I've seen is just called Gluten Guardian, which is way easier to spell and find. So Gluten Guardian, right? Different enzymes eat different stuff. So if you have that on hand for the if and when, right? If you're going to have something, you're like, there may have been some gluten in that, have this on hand because the enzyme is going to go in and sort of find it and eat away at it. And it's going to negate some of those metabolic consequences. Other than that, it's everything else that we said. If you can time a little fast after, if you can do a postprandial walk, even a little fasted workout, if your body's acclimated to that, a sauna session, take some silver, some charcoal, something to help kind of get the needle moving there with your gut microbiome. But gosh, if it is a sensitivity, I recommend just finding something else to eat, and that's probably your best bet, along with all the sensitivities we talked about.
Thank you. Real quick, Susan has our last question. She was just asking about if HLA gene for celiac gluten is the same HLA gene for mold sensitivity. If not, what's the RSID number? Or yeah, the RSID number. Short answer, no. HLA genes associated with celiac disease, gluten intolerance are not the same HLA genes associated with mold sensitivity. They're both within the broader HLA region, but they involve different alleles. So, and there's no single RSID for mold susceptibility HLA type. So, if you want to do some research in this, probably I would look at, typing in or doing some research for HLA mold susceptibility, high resolution HLA typing. There's some resources, Shoemaker's CIRS HLA tables. Also looking at any peer-reviewed papers on HLA DR and environmental antigens would actually give you some more information. So thank you for that. All right, we have come to the end of this webinar, and I want to say thank you, Justin. Always, you are just so brilliant, so insightful, and really appreciate, as I'm sure everybody on this webinar appreciates the information that you provide. So thank you. Thank you, everyone, for joining us.
Ditto. And yeah, I'm grateful for you. In Canada, we already had our Thanksgiving, but I hope all of you have a great one. And remember, it's all about gratitude. And we're absolutely grateful for you. And I hope you guys were able to learn something off myself and the wonderful Dr. Laura tonight.
Thank you. Hey, guys, also, please take a look at our DNA Talks Digest issue 6 that came out in October. We have our holiday guide. If you guys want, some great ideas for gifts, giving a test or, some of the products that we use and love, please check out our issue 6 and look at our holiday gift guide. So until then, have a fantastic day. I'm going to be back tomorrow. So we will see you then.
Take care, everybody.